Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Cécile Fromont, who is an Associate Professor of African and South Atlantic Art in the History of Art Department at Yale. Her writing and teaching focus on the visual, material, and religious culture of Africa and Latin America, with a special emphasis on the early modern period and on the Portuguese-speaking Atlantic world. Her first book, The Art of Conversion, Christian Visual Culture in the Kingdom of Kongo, won a number of awards, and her essays on African and Latin American art have appeared in a number of publications, including Colonial Latin American Review and African Arts. Today we'll talk with Professor Fromont about the circulation of African visual, material, and religious culture in the context of the slave trade within the early modern Atlantic world. Welcome, Professor Fromont.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with an overview of your work. Tell us about it.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'm actually at a very exciting point in the arc of research because I'm finishing two big projects and just starting on a new exciting one. The project that I'm finishing, the one deals with images that missionaries that went to Congo and Angola in the 17th and 18th century created as literally practical guides to the mission for future missionaries. And they're interesting because they're European images made by Europeans for Europeans, but I'm arguing that in fact they are co-productions between the local African populations and the missionaries, and so they should be read as both African images and European images.
Very interesting.
The second project is looking at pouches and packets that were masterminded by people of African birth or descent in the early modern Atlantic world that gave their wearers protection against vulnerability. And so they are understood as amulets or as different types of empowered packets. And there are ways in which the makers were able to bring scraps of European esoteric and religious material and transform them into objects of action and protection for Africans, but also Europeans.
Wow.
And as I'm thinking about these two projects, I encountered these new questions about what I think of as the material histories of the slave trade, thinking about those objects and those images and the ways in which they participated in creating the early modern world in the context of the rise and the apogee, really, of the slave trade era. So that new project is looking at the 18th century and looking at the exchange of objects between European merchants and African rulers on the Atlantic coast. But these objects are actually exquisite pieces that are made in Europe for particular rulers or particular merchants on the Atlantic coast as a way to create diplomatic and commercial relationships between the Europeans and the African merchants. And what's striking about these objects is they go against that perception that the slave trade was an unequal exchange between European merchants that were bringing trifles, things of little price and little sophistication to the Atlantic coast, and in exchange would obtain objects and merchandise of great value, and in particular enslaved men and women. But looking at these objects that are so fine, they're bespoke, they're made to the specifications of the African rulers, we start to see a very different type of exchange that is based on a very fine-grained engagement at the level of aesthetic and design between the two parties.
Okay, well, that sounds like really fascinating work for you. How did you become interested in it?
Yes, thank you. Well, you know, as an art historian, I spend a lot of time looking at written documents in archives, but I also spend a lot of time in museums looking at objects and really gaining a better understanding of the material and visual culture of the Atlantic world. And I was in a museum in the west of France that is focusing on France's connection with the Atlantic world. And I saw that object that was really a lightning bolt for me. And it was a silver knife or sword about this big that on the one hand had fine decorations and silversmithing that is really typical of late 18th century French metalworking, Rococo flowers and embellishments. But on the other hand, had the really typical shape of a chimpada, which is a type of ceremonial knife that was used in West Central Africa around the mouth of the Congo River. So by the shape, for me, it was clear that it was that type of object that I knew on the African context could be made of metal, sometimes they're made of wood, but in this case, it was silver, and on it was written a dedication to a particular person, Andrés Pukuta, who is an historical figure who lived in the second half of the 18th century on the coast of the Congo. And this object there that was so fine was made for that person. And it was such, so dedicated to him precisely that it literally had the name of that African ruler on it. And I remembered having read about that knife before through a short piece that the conservator of the museum had made, but seeing it in person was just a revelation in understanding the paradoxes that went into its making. That on the one hand, it was an object that was made to impress. It was silver, it's shiny, it's decorated. But on the other hand, you could see that there was attempts at saving some of the expense of making it. The blade was so thin that it could hardly stand on a stand. But it was, that piece that was really baffling. And so I started wondering, so what are the types of relationship that are involved in the making of that object? And what is that object in terms of innovation and in terms of the kinds of reckonings that the artists and the metal workers in France had to go through to create that piece? That, after all, was a French-made piece that was made after an African template of knife that was sent to an African ruler to impress him with the riches of France. So there was an entanglement of aesthetic decisions, design practices, and it really kind of challenged our understanding of that exchange of what merchants from Europe brought to the Atlantic coast. In this case, they had thought long and hard into what kind of objects they had to bring. And that really started me thinking about that exchange and really the possibilities that finding objects like this and studying them could open up in terms of understanding the early modern world better.
Okay, so let's talk about your methodology and how you did the research. So it must have been interesting for you to try and track how the knife came to be. So do you know who commissioned the knife for the African ruler? Tell us a bit about what you learned.
Yes, well, I'm at the beginning of that research in a way. So there is a lot that we know because we have the name of the African ruler, who was a person in charge in that particular region of dealing with European merchants. So European merchants needed his agreement to be able to trade in that region. And there was tremendous competitions between different places. So the French merchants were in competition against the Portuguese merchants, in competition against the Dutch merchants. And Andrés was the one who was deciding who could trade at what price and in what quantities. So they really needed to have his agreement.
Let me ask you, trading. So they were slaving trades. They were trading slaves as well as other goods. Yes.
Yes, they were trading slaves as well as other goods, but principally the core of the exchange at that in that region and at that moment of the late 18th century was really the trade in enslaved men and women. That's the main part of the story there. Yes.
All right, so continue where I interrupted you.
Yes. So they needed to impress Andrés with this kind of gift. And so I went back, and I'm starting to go back more systematically to the records that the slave traders were keeping about their activities. And these records were painstaking because the stakes economically were so high, and it involved all the mechanisms of what we think as a modern international trade. It involved insurance, it involved record keeping, double ledger accounting, and so we have this wealth of information that has been worked on really to great results by economic historians, but in a way that was more geared at understanding the macroeconomic picture of the development of Europe and Africa at one level, and then at a microeconomic level, thinking about the balance of the trade, who profited and to what extent. But going back to this document, as an art historian, I'm interested in the particularities of the objects that they are trading. When they're describing the type of cloth they are bringing to the African coast, they're describing exactly what type of cloth, what designs for what region is needed. And then they're describing some of those exceptional objects, such as the chimpada knife that I was discussing. And so going back to these records, you can flesh out a much more fine-grained history of the material exchange that went on the Atlantic coast.
Okay, so let's talk about how the exchange influenced, the art and aesthetic of both places. What have you found?
Yeah, so on the one hand, it is really intriguing to think about the ways in which artisans and artists in Europe were making objects for an African public. And we tend to think of the exchange in the other direction, that Europeans are collectors and connoisseurs and interested in exotic objects. But by these records, we know that this was true in the other direction, that African rulers were collectors and connoisseurs and really excited about exotic objects. And so it's fleshing out that process. And it's a process that really goes back to the first moment of the making of the Atlantic trade in slaves. We have very exciting documents from the early 16th century that describe the first encounters, the first decades of encounters, I should say, between Portugal and the Kingdom of Kongo, for example, in which the King of Portugal is sending panel paintings, metalworks, the finest kinds of objects that he would be sending to other rulers all around the world to impress his interlocutor in the Congo. And the King of Kongo is receiving them with great interest and is asking for more because he's interested about this newfangled artworks and objects. And on the other hand, the King of Kongo is sending the incredibly fine textile that his artisans are making, and these objects are also received with great enthusiasm at the court of Portugal. So it's really an exchange that goes both ways. And this is happening in the first decade of the 16th century in a way that we can approximate to diplomatic exchange elsewhere in the world, but just one step after discussing this exchange in the Portuguese document, you have the more sinister side that is embedded, in which the King of Portugal is giving direction to his diplomats of, oh, give this great gift to my brother, the King of Kongo. And then remember to tell him that I sent this gift at great cost, and so he should make sure that those ships are full of merchandise in return. And this merchandise is slaves, slaves, slaves. It repeats in the instructions,
Wow.
get slaves. And so that's the history that we are following, that I'm following over centuries. And it changes to some extent in the quantity, in the number of enslaved men and women that are being traded, but the nature of the objects that are going back and forth as a consequence remain a full range up to the very most fine objects that are being made in Europe. And so I'm interested in following that.
Right. I mean, it is fascinating to hear you speak of this, because I think many people, it's virtually unknown that the African leaders were complicit in sending their, brothers and sisters off to different lands to be slaves. I'm not necessarily sure that people are really aware of that, so I think that's very interesting, and that it was a one-way trade in reality, because while both coasts were trading these bespoke artistic objects, the slaves were only really going in one way. So I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I'm not sure how important it is to think of it in terms of being complicit. What we really need to get our head around is that it was a trade that was complex and sophisticated, and that involved two set of people whose goals, whose motivations were equally complex and equally sophisticated. And I think it's much more important to flesh out the story in this way, or it's equally important to flesh out the story in this way, to understand that the two parties involved were equally human in a way, in their motivations, in their goals, and in the means that they were using to achieve prosperity, which was the goal in both sides, and it took different forms. And really, what I want to achieve with that project is to have a better understanding of the ways in which Africa and Africans participated as full actors in the crafting of the Atlantic world, and in some of the most important aspects of the creation of the modern world of modernity, that we understand so far as a European story, or a story in which non-Europeans are serving as foils to the construction of the European modern subject, right? That is not a savage, for example. That is rational versus irrational. And looking at the terms of exchange and looking at the sophistication of African interlocutors, we can understand better the formation of that modernity, in that the Africans participated in it. They were not irrational. They didn't not understand the value of objects. They actually were parts of determining what value was, and what sophistication was, and what shape it took. And fleshing out that story really helps us understand our world much better.
Yes, I mean, it is a fascinating, I think, way to think about it, actually. So I'm curious to know, were there any surprises that you did not anticipate as you're doing your research? Did you come across anything that you said, wow?
Yeah, so there was that object, but also when you look at the record, and I knew the slave trading record existed, but I hadn't spent extensive time with them. And as I'm starting to delve into them, it's just mind-boggling how precise they are, and how much there was an engagement on the part of the slave traders with fine details of aesthetic values on the part of their interlocutors. So we can actually go back to the 16th century to some extent, but much more the 17th and the 18th century. and have really fine-grained descriptions of the preferences of African rulers, elite in particular, on different points of the African continent, on the Atlantic side.
Can you tell us about some of them?
I have general examples, but one of them would be the really exciting reception that blue checkered cloth received in Central Africa, which is a very kind of modest type of cloth that is literally a cotton with blue check on it. And it was received in Central Africa, in Congo and Angola, as this object that then was integrated into the regalia of the rulers, so that you see images that were made of African rulers at the time in West Central Africa, and they're wearing their very prestigious cap of status, chains of gold, really fancy things, and this blue check cloth that really becomes part of their regalia and becomes a way of heralding their power and their legitimacy. And probably my hypothesis is that part of it has to do with showcasing the reach of their power, right? Or their ability to reach, harness, and mobilize long-distance trade network and make it part of the reasons why they are legitimate rulers. And then this cloth continues to be used for centuries and ends up being used in those power objects that we imagine sometimes as typical of the African continent. So figures in human forms that are empowered, activated with nails and other shards of metal. And these shards of metal sometimes are tied with this blue and white check. So in there, that textile continues to talk about power and sophistication for centuries. And what's interesting is that these objects are really the emblem of wrong ideas about the heart of darkness, right? Africa is untouched and having this, ancestral, ahistorical practices. But these objects are actually eminently historical in that they were created at the moment of the height of the slave trade and through objects that are being traded and that arrive on the continent with the long-distance trade, enslaved in particular, and through which the rulers express power. And so the idiom of power is linked to Atlantic network and is linked to imported objects.
Okay. I'm curious to know if you were able to find any of the objects in Africa versus, the museums of Europe. So do they still have some of the pieces there?
Yes, absolutely. I'm at the stage of the research that I'm going to spend a lot of time looking at the European records first in terms of the slave trading records, and then going to museums that have some of these objects in Europe. But also, I want to go into the factories. Some of them are still in activities in terms of textile making in Europe to look at their record and see, what they have in terms of that particular moment in their activity. And then once I have a better understanding of what and how and what it looked like, the second part of my research will be to go back to some places on the African Atlantic coast and conduct oral histories when I know exactly what to ask and about what type of objects and features. It would be interesting to know more. Sure. I have been in some of the museum and repositories. Some of them are linked to still local rulers in around the mouth of the Congo, for example. And some of these trade objects are very much there, still displayed as part of the regalia of the rulers or part of the kind of elite objects of a past that is not so distant. And so it would be really interesting to look at that. And some of the objects also end up being part of funerary materials that are decorating, or I should say more enhancing, the tombs of rulers. Sometimes the actual objects, but in other times these objects recast in stone, or more recently in cement, that they are remade in a more durable form in a way to be on top of this tomb. So I'm really also looking forward to conducting that part of the research.
Okay, well, we will look forward to seeing more from you on this topic. Very interesting. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much. That was a great conversation.
Thank you. For more information about Professor Fromont and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.